All right, salamat everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I'd like to welcome you all to this very important conversation with our guests, Wendy Bacon and Yaakov Aharon. Today's session is titled Promoting Israel in Australia, the Influence of the Israel Lobby on Australian Politics and Media. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and Australia Palestine Advocacy Network and Free Palestine Melbourne, endorsed by other organizations across this continent and also New Zealand. Before I start introducing our guests, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands from which we're all dialing in today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to acknowledge that we're all dialing in from ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. I'd like to acknowledge that we are all in pain and devastation today, not only because of the ongoing massacre that is taking place in front of our eyes for the past 20 months in Gaza, but because of the atrocious murder of yet another Indigenous man a few days ago. I'd like to pay a tribute to Komanjai White, a Warralbiri man who was pinned to the ground until he stopped breathing by an off-duty police member at a Coles supermarket in Alice Springs. I think I speak on behalf of everyone today who are attending in saying that I stand in solidarity with First Nations peoples and their struggle against injustice and colonial violence, and in demanding justice for Komanjai. My decolonization struggle and that of the First Nations peoples is one. Again, I want to welcome everyone who is joining us today to this webinar, and I extend that welcome to those who are joining us from the dark side. In particular, for those guests, I should say that all opinions expressed by myself today represent my own personal views as a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to live on this colony and who happened to have his family enduring the past 20 months of the Zionist genocide in Gaza. And anything I say should not be construed or misconstrued as me using any authority or agency bestowed upon me as part of my workplace. Now, the Zionist regime, leadership, and society has proven to us time and time again over the past 20 months that it is not worthy of being part of the international community. It is losing the legal and moral support of the public opinion. It is becoming a pariah regime, although in a frustratingly slow pace. If it wasn't for the international support that this genocide regime is getting from the Western sponsors, including the US and this country, the state of Israel could never sustain its genocidal campaign in Gaza and Palestine for this long. Many argue, at least in the US, that the Zionist lobby gets all the credit for maintaining the American support for the state of Israel. Some argue that similar arrangements are taking place in this country, whereby the Israeli lobby wields a great influence on our political infrastructure, as well as academia and media. Coming out of the 2025 federal election today, we will zoom in on the Israel lobby's influence on our media and politics with some focus on the recent election. This is an incredibly important topic. This is evidenced by the number of people who are attending today and the number of registrations. We have more than 600 registrations to this webinar. I am delighted today to be in conversation with two journalists who are very well informed and have written extensively on the matter. It gives me pleasure to be in conversation with Wendy Bacon and Yaakov Aharon. Wendy Bacon is an independent investigative journalist and lifelong radical activist. She has investigated miscarriages of justice, deaths in custody, News Corp's coverage of climate change, urban developments, police corruption, and most recently, astroturfing in the 2025 federal election. Welcome, Wendy, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, everyone. Good to be here.
Welcome. Yaakov Aharon is new to journalism, having come from a background of activism. Yaakov brings unique perspectives to the Palestinian struggle, credited to his political journey away from the ultra-Orthodox Jewish and pro-Israel education of his youth. His research concerns the Israel lobby, Jewish community, party politics, and arms trade. Welcome, Yaakov, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I know many of the audience have a lot of questions, but let me start off with a few questions of mine before we go into the Q&A session. So this question is for both of you, really, but I do want to start with you, Yaakov. I'd like to delve straight away into the conversation by outlining the main Israel lobbying groups in Australia. We know about this invisible force that is called Israel Lobby, but we also know that it's normally formed by a number of organizations. So can you give us an insight on what these organizations are, what are their legal statuses as well, and briefly how they operate?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of what I know about the Israel lobby comes from having seen the way it works as a child, as I came of age. One of my first jobs was actually with the Jewish Board of Deputies. You could say I'm atoning for my sins now by spilling out the dirt. I was, more than a decade ago, so I've obviously been on a political journey away from that. But I remember on day one when I worked at the Jewish Board of Deputies, they showed me to my desk, told me where the bathroom is, so on. And then they said, well, this is what you need to know. First thing they said, we don't criticize current Israeli government policy. And really, that's a rule across the board for all these Jewish communal organizations, almost down to the synagogues, the grassroots levels, straight up to the very top. And so this is why they get to say, well, we're not really the Israel lobby. I mean, even to say that there is an Israel lobby is considered anti-Semitic by some of these guys, because so many of these groups are charities that describe themselves as religious organizations. And for them to be Jewish is to be Zionist. So they are procedurally in lockstep with Israel's sitting government. If there was a bit more of a moderate government, and you forget the current state of the Israeli opposition, then there would be a more moderate Israel lobby in Australia. Of course, Zionism is still necessarily a genocidal ideology, but there are ways to do it a bit more subtly than what's being done right now. And the large majority of Jewish organizations in Australia, they're incredibly structured, bureaucratic, interconnected, top-down style of leadership. And at the top, you get these federal peak-roof bodies, the Executive Council Australian Jewry and the Zionist Federation of Australia. So these groups have constituent organizations, they call them, which receive benefits in return for being constituents, including funding, representation, a seat at the table at the council or federation meetings. And these constituent organizations will either have an objective relevant to Jews across Australia as well, or they are peak-roof bodies of a state like New South Wales. So underneath the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, ECAJ for short, there's the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. And underneath that, you get synagogues, community centers, Jewish day schools, these things. And you can think of this as almost like there's different levels of government, federal, state, local governments. And these all have, almost all of them tax deductible status. Then you get these rogue groups that have popped up, especially recently. You get in 2017, there was the Australian Jewish Association, AJA. And they really went to war with what you could call the establishment of the lobby, ECAJ and ZFA, because they weren't loyal to them. They sat on the outside, and they were blatantly far right. And they were outside of the establishment's control. You could kind of think of this as like in 2016 when Trump came on stage at the Republican presidential debates and, just put two fingers up and said, I'm running my own campaign. And of course, it was all ran by really, billionaire donors still. But there's this facade of, we're against the establishment. Back then, you had Mark Liebler, who runs the establishment of the lobby, calling out AJA for being racist and being close with fascists like Pauline Hanson. And in fact, Liebler hounded them out of community centers and got the centers who were hosting AJA events to get them to cancel those events. So what's changed now is because you have the most fascist government in Israeli history. And of course, Israel's always been genocidal regardless. But you have the most fascist government. So now you have the most fascist Israel lobby in our history because they're procedurally in lockstep with each other. And it also allows these rogue groups like AJA to pop up on the fringe and drag it even further. Because when they say that they are representing what Israeli people really believe, and taking that to Jewish Australians and lobbying on behalf of Jewish Australians, when they say that they are the only Jewish Australian community group with major representation that spits in the face of a two-state solution, they are actually telling the truth, because the establishment organizations will pay lip service to a two-state solution. And AJA doesn't play that game. And they're actually telling the truth when they say, we're the real guys representing what Israelis want, what Jewish Australians want, because they've all been dragged further and further to the right by the Bibi Netanyahu government. And just one last point, there's something really significant happening now as well, in that in November last year, the Zionist Federation of Australia apologized profusely to the Jewish community and acknowledged that they had actually failed to represent them on a grassroots level. That was too much of a top-down style of leadership. And what they did was they amended their constitutional requirements to become a constituent organization, so that it could open itself up to new constituents who were quote unquote grassroots organizations. And a lot of these we saw pop up in the recent election as running campaigns, as explicitly political, telling people to put the Greens last. And a lot of these groups as well were really closely tied with the AJA.
I would like to delve deeper into these kind of intricacies as well as we progress in the conversation. But it's interesting that you say the lobbies also move to the right as the Israeli government is moving to the right, because exactly the same phenomena is happening in the US, as Elaine Pape's recent book explains. But Wendy, I really want to go to you in this about those organizations. You've written extensively about their behavior and their attitude towards government and media. So how has been their influence, the Israel lobbies group organizations' influence in government and media in general?
Well, just first of all, I'd like to say, Ahmed, that I'd just like to touch on something you said earlier about deaths in custody, because some of the things when we're talking about the media, some of the things we're talking about, some of the problems of the Australian media are problems for other issues too, not to in any way minimise the seriousness of what we're talking about now. And deaths in custody is an amazing example of that. I did a study actually after 30 years from the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody of the media coverage of that issue during a period when the recommendations weren't implemented and deaths in custody continued until just this week, with this horrific news. And in fact, there was almost no coverage. So silence is a major problem as well as vilification, stigmatizing people. The other side of that is silence. Now, just coming to the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby, look, I've been aware of that for an awfully long time. I guess even before like 2000, like even going back like before when many people watching this were born, after 1975 in Australia, when it became clear that Whitlam, Gough Whitlam, might have been tending the Labor Party to be more pro-Palestinian. That's really when, at a political level, the Zionist lobby began in the Labor Party. And so there's a very, very long tail to this, and tail in both in story terms and in length of time. Now, I do agree with what I think it's very important to focus on this recent period and the developments that Yaakov is talking about. But, today I was just having a look at Anthony Lowenstein, who published his book, and I knew Anthony before that. He's an Australian journalist, for those who I think many people listening or watching will know, who's written a very important book called Palestinian Laboratory. Now, Anthony was initially a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald when I first knew of him, and he left, as far as I'm aware, because it was not possible to be questioning Israeli policies while you're a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, there may have been other reasons, but he then went on to write a book called My Israeli Question. I think that's what it's called. And
Yes.
in 2006, that was. So we're now talking about 20 years ago, when Michael Danby, who has played a very specific role in this election in the seat of McNamara, and we may come back to that, but he's was long-term Labor MP for Melbourne Ports. Now, he was one of those who is still active, but he entered the Labor Party, I think probably with a very big part of his mission was to advance Israel's interests. And, when Anthony published his book, he attacked Melbourne University Press and said, how could you publish this completely fringe, terrible person? How could you even publish a book by him? And at the time, Anthony talked about how anti-Semitism, like back then, that whole idea of the self-hating Jew, and some people like Peter Slezak and others have been experiencing this for decades, but that was really a form of weaponizing anti-Semitism. But at the time, Anthony talked about that it was a way to silence dissent on the Jewish state, on the state of Israel. So, it just was, I think, and, knowing ABC correspondence as I did in the Middle East, you did hear how language was censored and you couldn't use certain words. So, we've come to a really extreme point, I think, in this recent election and over the last year or two, but it has been a long process. Look, I think there's various aspects to the influence on the media, but I also think that we need to see it in the context of an Islamophobic media. Now, over those decades, we go back to the 1990s, say, or ever since then, but there's a huge amount of research and documentation done to demonstrate. When I was teaching at UTS, had many students who would do case studies on this and just look at the way Islamophobia infused the media. Now, as well as that, you had the Zionist lobby influencing particular journalists and keeping the narrative going in a certain direction. And recently I attended a seminar or a forum, an amnesty forum with Noor Hagar, Antoinette Lattouf, and Jan Fran. And they're three now, not young, but I knew them when they were younger, coming out of the western suburbs of Sydney with a whole critique of the media, with an understanding that they came, in a sense, from the margins. And I heard them articulate this the other night, that journey of journalism, and it's no accident now. And I think we need to also, when we look at the problems with the media and their lack of serious coverage of Gaza, and we can talk about the ABC in relation to that, but there has been an engagement, if you like, that the media is not getting away. The mainstream or legacy media, as it's now often called, have not got the game completely sewn up. You know, there's a real counter to that coming from even people like yourself, Yaakov, all of those journalists, the work that Anti has done. We are really not prepared to accept it anymore, that there will be this sanitized account of what is happening. So I could obviously go into more specific examples, but I hope that sets some of the scene, that I think we have to remember some of the factors we have to remember when we're looking at it. And you know, the Islamophobia exists, you know, in all different sorts of ways. If we look at the video, the video that was taken down by the ABC that Media Watch covered this week. You know,
Yes.
an interview, and a straight out interview, and it was removed. So you can have straight out acts of censorship like that, and whether they want to call it that or not, I would call it that. Or you can have just silencing and people in the background who are writing pieces, for example, for the ABC, have to negotiate phrase by phrase what can be published or not published. So this media control takes all sorts of forms.
So the media coverage is almost the same, even probably worse.
Oh, well, I think, again, I think it's really hard to say worse, but I think that act of getting rid of Antoinette from the ABC really absolutely shocked. And one thing I would like to say about that, that was brought about by the pro-Israeli lobby, by the Zionist lobby. And in fact, what they did was organize themselves into a great big WhatsApp group, more than one WhatsApp group actually, to lobby, to make those phone calls, to lay those complaints. But you know, people were sort of shocked because it was exposed, because these days it is easier to expose things like that with social media, and WhatsApp groups can be penetrated and all that sort of thing. But really, that was sort of business as usual with a bit more intensity.
That's fair enough. There's a lot to say about these things, like you mentioned, Wendy. There's so many examples. But I do want to go to my second question. It looks like people are eager and already there's a few questions in there. So Yaakov, I want to go to you. We've been hearing a lot about the word Hasbara. That's in Arabic, and then Hasbara in English. And, you know, it means, I think it means in Hebrew, public relations, something like that. So can you tell us what is Hasbara, and how is this concept of Hasbara seen and understood by the Jewish community? You know, you mentioned in our conversation before we start, as it feels as if it is a civic duty, kind of non-political really, but it's just an obligation kind of thing. So can you give us some insight into Hasbara?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's actually the first I've heard that it's also an Arabic word. This shows how much I don't know really. But you know, it is also a Hebrew word, which of course steals a lot of words from Arabic. It literally means to explain, but realistically, it's you know, to propagandize. There's a lot of talking points distributed from, you know, the Israeli embassy in Canberra, from the Israeli Ministry of Combating Anti-Semitism and Diaspora Affairs. Yes, that's a real cabinet ministry over there. And what it is a um, it's a civic duty. They think of it as Jews, we have anti-Semites. It's a necessary, just inherent part of the Jewish experience, that there's always going to be people who are, coming out for our blood. That's the narrative, at least. So because the narrative says, well, Israel defends all Jews against anti-Semitism, therefore it's every Jew's duty to defend Israel. And of course, the Zionist dream is to make Aliyah and immigrate over there. But if a Jew is living in the diaspora and they're not a perfect Zionist, then at least what they're required to do is to take up the civic duty to fight in the political spaces and the media where it says, anti-Semitism has taken over. And so, even though you are required to go and be active in political spaces and in media to explain Israel's perspective, this isn't really seen as a political action. It's seen as, common decency, as human rights. You're supporting Jews' right to national self-determination and to have a Jewish state. And it's presented as anti-racism. And so a lot of these Israel lobby groups, which describe themselves as Jewish communal groups, we're talking even synagogues and day schools, will have what's called anti-Semitism training, which is how to explain to someone if you run into them, if you happen to leave Bondi and you encounter an anti-Semite. This is how you explain to someone why Jews deserve a Jewish state, why Zionism is a common sense approach, why it's our human right to have a Jewish ethno-state. And these kids who are being taught this don't even realize that they're being indoctrinated by political ideology.
This is interesting because I read in Herzl diaries when he was asked how do you define a Jew, and the way he described it, he said a Jew is whoever anti-Semites hate. So as for a Zionist, they're allowing anti-Semites to define what a Jew is. So it's to me it's just a twisted way of looking at things. Wendy, did you want to add anything to this question?
Or just in terms of what Yaakov was just saying about how people come to believe these things, and obviously there is a process, an educational or indoctrination type process, and I was struck by that, and we're going to come back to that probably, but I was struck by that when I was covering the recent election campaign and went out to Wentworth where Better Australia was campaigning, which is a Zionist group, which we might come back to, but it was very, very much campaigning against Allegra Spender. And I talked to some of the people who've been recruited, as volunteers. And one young Israeli woman said to me that her sister she was staying with had asked her to do it. And, Allegra Spender was really very seriously anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And, there was no way that she was going to be persuaded otherwise. So I think it becomes very deeply embedded in a frame in which you interpret the world. But I think also for me, when I'm sort of looking at media strategies, I've become sort of, I guess, interested in investigating, but it's much more serious than just an investigation, the impact of it. But things like, for example, that narrative that happened after October the 7th, very quickly, that narrative was put out about beheading of babies, that Hamas had beheaded babies. Now that turned out, and even Biden, I think, said he'd seen photos, and so that turned out not to be true. And similar to in a similar way, some of the allegations about rape. Now, I'm not saying that no rapes have happened on the part of Palestinian fighters. I'm not saying that. I'm not in a position to say that. But what I do know was that there was not the wholesale pack rape, because the New York Times put out that article and it was deconstructed by journalists, I think, at The Intercept. And really seriously, good journalism sort of unpacked and exposed. And, but by then there was no telling a lot of people that isn't true, because the amount of detail you've got to go into. So these narratives grab hold. In Australia, the gas the Jews, the falsified tape was another example of that. And if you can get a narrative going like that, and there is, I think, clearly a strategy behind that sort of activity, then it's very hard, particularly with our media today, our mainstream media, which tends to be very superficial and just sort of put narratives, maybe not particularly those ones at the moment, but a good example of this was when Gillian Segal was interviewed recently by the ABC breakfast show by Sally Sara, who's a highly respected journalist, I've got to say. And Gillian Segal, who's meant to be the envoy for anti-Semitism, or is the envoy, but a very serious player in the Zionist lobby from a long way back, she just absolutely defamed the Greens, described them as anti-Semitic without evidence for that. She no doubt believes it because she sees criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And a lot of complaints have gone in about that. But, Sally Sara has so far been defended by the ABC by saying it was a live interview. Now, she's a very experienced interviewer. I think this pressure that builds up from the Zionist lobby actually intimidates journalists and makes them ultra careful and not do the things that they would normally do, like pull someone up and question them. So we could compare that example with Gillian Segal, which is now with the Ombudsman at the ABC. So we'll see whether that, just to allow someone to defame a whole group of people without interruption is going to be judged to be okay. But we can compare that to the Nasser Mashni example that I referred to before, of just pulling down a video when he also was allowed to speak uninterrupted. But his interview gets taken down. The other one just, is allowed to stay there with a small excuse. And this is how the end result, I think, of these ways of seeing the world that have far too much influence on get into the heads of journalists, and particularly the managers of journalists.
I do want to get back to Gillian Segal as well, but I couldn't help but picking up on something that you said, Wendy. On the outside, it seems that, Zionist organizations kind of align better with conservative right-wing organizations in Australia, talking about Liberal Party, Advance Australia, and even the right wing of the Labours. So how is Israel lobby in Australia involved with these kind of far right organizations? I mean, why do they always align?
Well, I think the Labor Party depends. Look, always with these questions does depend to some extent what we mean by right wing or left wing. There's no doubt that there's a strong, powerful Zionist lobby within the Labor Party, and the organisation I mentioned before, Better Australia, is both Labor and Liberal. But on the other hand, we can say, well, they're right wing Labor. But Yaakov mentioned before the Australian Jewish Association, which is a far right organisation. They're anti-immigration, they're far right on a number of issues, and they are aligned with Advance. And Advance is a far right lobby group that played a very powerful role in The Voice. So those connections are there. But I think what to some extent has happened with the Zionist lobby and right-wing politics is they've gained, not only have they got their own versions which are connected with Advance, and Australian Jewish Association has partnered with Advance. Then we've got another one called the Minority Impact Coalition that's connected with the Queensland Jewish Collective, and they also have now they're quite obviously connected with Advance. So, there's specific offshoots. I don't know whether Yaakov would like to add anything to that, but it's definitely become an aspect of it. And if we take Advance, they're not stopping with the election. They claim a certain amount of influence in the election results, but I've every now and again checked what they're doing, and they're heading straight on for the next election. They've got, I think, up to 35 staff and millions of dollars. So the Zionist lobby is attached to them, and I think playing quite a big influence probably on them as well.
I do want to get your input on this, Yaakov, but I also want you to explain to what extent is Zionism an inherently far-right ideology? Is that the right designation of Zionism?
No, it is complicated. I think Zionism in its current form is absolutely fascist. And there's no way around that. But it is still an adaptable ideology that presents different faces at different times when it's appropriate. And its public image would not survive if it did not do this. So, Zionism, of course, does have a fascist face that it presents, but it also has this liberal Zionist face, this indigenous liberation face, where it says it's, land back for the indigenous people of Israel. It's got a queer face. Israel's this gay haven in the among the homophobic Arab world. And what I find really interesting is Mark Liebler. He delivered a speech to the Jewish Community Council of Western Australia in 2018, which got leaked to John Menadue. And he said that it's really important to tailor your approach. He provided a guide, his own guide for young up and coming lobbyists, and he said you always need to pick your message. So sure, it's got a fascist face, but you need to know when you're speaking to liberals, present the liberal face. And there's a double speak of Zionism that's always there, in that, Israel is freeing Gaza from Hamas, let's say. But then at the same time, they'll say, oh, the whole Palestinian nation is responsible. And both of these narratives exist simultaneously. But because the Zionists and Israel lobby have this anxiety of airing dirty laundry, not airing dirty laundry of Jewish communal issues, of Israeli politics in public, because they feel like it's going to stoke anti-Semitism if they, in any way criticize Israel publicly. You get these people who are on the same side, Zionist side, with fundamentally contradicting narratives. You can't say, well, Israel's a Jewish ethno-state and Jewish people have a right to set up a state like that, while at the same time saying, oh, Israel's a democratic state representing everyone equally. But these narratives still coexist, and they never actually fight with each other in the public eye. They just present each other to the public, to the media, when it's appropriate. So, it is important to remember that Zionism was founded by people who proclaimed themselves to be socialists. And you could argue whether they were real socialists or not, but colonialism was very trendy at the time in the 19th century, and colonialism wasn't thought of as a conservative thing. And of course, back then the Zionists were very open across the board. There was no doublespeak then about whether Zionism was a colonial movement, and socialists did colonialism too. So, of course, Israel could never have come into existence without a genocide. But I don't think it's fair to say that Zionism was always fascist, or that leftists cannot commit fascism. And I think this thinking leads to us to avoid self-reflection as leftists.
Do you think Zionism could also have a left wing and more conservative side as well? I mean, we've been reading about Jabotinsky and the revisionist Zionism as well. So what, I mean, could that be fitting within the conservative side of this leftist movement?
Well, what's important to understand about Zionism is because it is a movement to set up a Jewish ethno-state that doesn't represent everyone equally. That there are progressive policies, but those progressive policies among Zionists and debated in Israeli parliament will only ever reach Jews, Israeli Jews, or to a lesser extent, what they call Arab Israelis who have remained quiet because of fear of persecution without ever calling themselves Palestinians. So, sure, you get free healthcare there, free education, subsidized housing. But these are progressive policies if they reached everyone equally. And unfortunately, they only reach citizens who have a very particular bloodline, a Jewish bloodline.
This is really interesting insight. Hopefully we'll dig deeper into these with the Q&A. I really encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to them hopefully soon. We'll get to most of them. I can see a lot of questions flowing in. I do have a question or two before we start the Q&A. So I want to change gear and talk about anti-Semitism. And I want to start with you, Yaakov, as well. How authoritative have been the reports on anti-Semitism in Australia? I mean, I remember I had a conversation with Professor Peter Slezak, and we talked in length about whether it's actually credible statistics that we're hearing from, predominantly Zionist organizations reporting on anti-Semitism. So, and also, I also want to pile on this question. What has been the role of the special envoy on anti-Semitism? You mentioned Gillian Siegel, Wendy. So if you could give us a compact answer to that question, Yaakov.
Sure. I think, well, the most important thing on that question is that the Executive Council of Australian Jewry publishes an annual anti-Semitism report, and it compiles all the list of incidents. None of these incidents are verified. Anyone can file a report, and none of them are questioned, but in any sort of way. So, for example, it says that it only includes incidents which specifically target the Jewish community. So there's incidents where Christians were wearing an Israeli flag and they were targeted. And then it says, well, the abusive people, the anti-Semites, clearly assumed that they were of Jewish heritage, so it was anti-Semitic by nature. There's another one where people held a protest outside Elbit Systems office in Melbourne, with advocating for BDS. Okay, apparently that's anti-Semitic and made it to the register. I mean, these things are just massively inflated. And there's another one. There was a sticker placed across the road from the Great Synagogue in Elizabeth Street in Sydney CBD, where, across the road, there's weekly Palestine protests, simply because it's the CBD. I mean, it's the biggest park in Sydney. It's the best place to hold a protest. But there was a sticker placed across the road that said, "From the river to the sea," put on a street pole. Okay, that made the register as well. They only actually named about 100 of the 700 incidents. So you'd assume that they only named the most serious ones. Well, the most serious one includes a sticker across the road.
And I think to say something here about, I think that Yaakov has actually written about this study, if we could call it study, if people want to read more detail. But I think it's really dodgy. Like from a media point of view, if you got a survey like that, if you were doing serious journalism, you would really ask about, well, how credible is this? All the things that Yaakov is raising. But the really worrying thing is this thing goes out into the sort of media sphere and is likely to turn up as if this is a credible news finding, and that we all need to really take account of it. And to me, one of the problems with it is sort of trivializes actual anti-Semitism.
I was about to ask you, Wendy, like what impact could that have on the Jewish community? I mean, just to perpetuate that kind of living in fear?
Well, I think the living in fear thing is, well, I can't talk from personal experience, and Yaakov may want to add something here, but, certainly if you put out reports, as happened with the caravan incident, and you say there's a mass terror event about to happen, could be about to happen in Sydney, that is going to spell fear into the hearts of Jewish community and other people too, for that matter, and that is itself damaging and an actual thing. So yes, the amplification of it means that is a separate effect of it. So that's really worrying. And the fact that I don't think the Executive Council of Jewry is the appropriate body to be doing this survey. I'd like to see something like the Human Rights Commission. And then, of course, everything depends on the definition of anti-Semitism. So we all get back to this really, the heart of it, which is the criticism of Israel, or spelling out a different position, is seen as anti-Semitic. So you become an anti-Semitic person if you do that, and you can be labeled as that. And that is,
and even the selection of the envoy to anti-Semitism as well has been problematic for some.
absolutely. I mean, do you want to say something about Gillian Siegel, Yaakov? I mean, I was just shocked. When I heard that the government had appointed Gillian Siegel, I thought, well, that's like appointing someone from the heart of the Zionist lobby.
Yeah, and someone who has built a career based on saying that any anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic. I mean, it's in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition that she's constantly worked to introduce the policy to workplaces and everything. And with Gillian Siegel, so her husband is John Roth, who runs a property development business with his brother Stanley Roth. Now, Stanley Roth is on the board of United Israel Appeal to this day, which is a charity worth like $50 million, constantly raising money for quote unquote the war effort in Israel. And John and Stanley Roth's business that they run together, Hen Roth, directly funds Advance, $50,000, right? So they are directly connected to all this. And essentially the government, the Australian government, has paid the Israel lobby to have someone in-house, literally in Parliament House, on the taxpayer dime, to advocate for Israel by saying, well, any opposition to Zionism or any advocacy for a one-state solution is anti-Semitic. And with the Great Synagogue sticker that I mentioned before, both her and the Rabbi Ben Elton of Great Synagogue had very similar messages in response to this apparent targeting of the Great Synagogue. Ben Elton attended a protest together with Ophir Birnbaum in, I believe, November. He said, every single week my synagogue has been targeted by the Palestine protests. Well, no, it hasn't. I mean, there's protests across the road in Sydney's biggest park because you're in the central business district. There was a sticker. It's not threatening. And to the latest New South Wales anti-Semitism inquiry, they really strongly criticised the Labor Party for passing legislation banning protests nearer places of worship. because the Labour Party explicitly refused to name a precise distance that was required, which is actually even terrible in its own way because it's vague. It means it's open to the discretion of the COP to say, well, you're a kilometre out, you're 100 metres out, you're 50 metres out. There's a Palestine protest, but there's a church nearby. There's a church of Scientology nearby, who knows what. But Gillian Siegel advocated for 500 metres on the record. Rabbi Ben Elton 150 meters. And this is the game they're playing. That's the influence these reports have. It starts with a sticker on Sydney's busiest streets, and it ends with that.
Yes, I mean, we've been hearing, and part of the conversation I had with Professor Peter Slezak as well about the weaponization as well of anti-Semitism, and also maintaining fear in the Jewish community. So how far has the Zionist lobby gone into weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to, like you mentioned, silence these protests and silence these anti-genocide activism? If you want to add a little bit to that as well, Wendy, I know one of the most prominent stories that we've heard recently was, well, there's a number of stories. The Cairo Cafe manufactured, kind of attempt to manufacture anti-Semitism. There's the Jural van. Could you give us some insight on that before we get into the Q&A?
Just before I mention a little bit more about Ophir Birnbaum and the Cairo takeaway, just in terms of suppression of dissent and how anti-Semitism is being weaponized by the Zionist lobby, there are many people I think we could mention. But one person who it's happening to at the moment is Mary Kostakidis, who's a well-known anti-Zionist and a journalist. And, for just a couple of tweets that somebody might not like, but reporting, just like Antoinette did, reporting things that people are saying, that is what journalists do. She is now being seriously taken on human rights infringements. She's ended up in the federal court. It's hugely expensive. It demobilizes her, if you like. And this is also happening to people at Sydney University. So I think we almost need a database of the impact of the lobby on the numbers of people whose lives have been affected, apart from the general community. But Ophir Birnbaum is an interesting character, but I think we need to say that he was very involved with Better Australia, which has been involved with local government elections in New South Wales, and now the federal elections, very much.
And that's a bipartisan kind of organization.
Yeah, it's a bipartisan organisation. So he's on the, if you like, Labour side. I don't know if he's still a member of the Rosebery branch of the Labor Party, but he certainly was, and was reported by, just in passing, by the Sydney Morning Herald to have been in the Labor Party. His partner, Sophie Calland, is, if you like, the executive officer, the main person running the organisation, and she's also in the Labor Party. So they're partners, married. Now, Ophir really drew attention to himself when he was doing this undercover so-called documentary with News Corp, and, going off to discover anti-Semitism. Now, he ended up, there was a big scene when News Corp got uncovered in the Cairo takeaway. Actually, there was inaccurate versions of what exactly had happened, which made it more messy, if you like. But then Yaakov and I started looking a bit more at Ophir Birnbaum. And I think there were other people in the media, but in the non-mainstream media, I think at Crikey also working on this. We're not the only ones, but once we sort of started looking at him, the fact that he is Israeli Australian, but the range of protests he'd been at, the speaking at rallies. He was in Never Again is Now. Is that what that organisation is called?
Yes, he's a founding organizer.
Yeah, he's a founding organizer with a man called Mark Leach, who is a far-right Christian, who is also involved with Never Again is Now. So he was connected with all these people over a period of a year. He'd been at all sorts of protests. He was down in Melbourne the very weekend before, involved with the Paran election, by-election, and then he was back up here linking up with News Corp again for his undercover activities. Now, when we exposed him and we sent questions to a person in Israel who was apparently connected with him, we never really could get to the bottom of that. But suddenly, 20 minutes after these questions went off, all social media, thousands of posts of Ophir's disappear offline, and all trace was gone. Pretty much, you can find the odd picture of him, and we'd published pictures. Anyway, now he cropped up again. He was there all the time. He was working on the Better Australia campaign for the federal election. And he was up in the seat of Richmond on election day at Ocean Shores, handing out leaflets saying the Greens are terrorists, that sort of thing. So, he might be quiet now, but he's still a factor. And I think what is most interesting about him, because he's not the only person like that, but is the range of different strategies that he is deploying over a period of time to spread the message of anti-Semitism, if you like, accusing everybody else of being anti-Semitic. He's also done undercover filming of protests and of the Greens. And so that's just a little bit. And I think really the most interesting thing for now is, what does it tell us about how the Zionist lobby is working? And I think, Yaakov, I might hand over to you now, because I think it's easy to dismiss these people. And I think people do this a little bit. They're just these trolls. But Yaakov, would you just like to add something to who he keeps company with? And
Yeah. I mean, the length, how long those guys are prepared to go to kind of demonize the anti-genocide movement is incredible. Yaakov, briefly, if you may, just to allow for more questions, if you want to add anything to Wendy's.
Sure. I mean, yeah, Ophir Birnbaum, it's very easy to underestimate him. And Wendy and I uncovered, it was really Wendy, that Better Australia was actually taking advice from some really important people. Yaron Finkelstein, who was previously the secretary to Scott Morrison, Eric Roosendahl, who was the former treasurer of New South Wales Labor, involved in quite a few different scandals implicating that he may have been corrupt. And of course, both of these guys served in the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies in very senior positions at the same time. And what we realized when we found these documents is that actually this was really a roundtable meeting with very important people, and everyone there has earned their spot. Just because the fear trolls people with Looney Tunes theme songs in the background, it doesn't mean this guy is as hopeless as he might be assumed to be. Looney Tunes is not the soundtrack to this guy's life. He meets with major players, and it's fair to say that now that Ophir Birnbaum and Sophie Calland are major players in the Israel lobby.
And one other person we could mention, just to show those, I guess, cross-party ties, is there's a person called Alex Poulsen, who was involved with Sophie Calland from the very beginning. And he is a Liberal Party Zionist who worked for Simon Birmingham, who was a senator recently retired. I should just say about Roosendahl that he's the patron of Labor Friends of Israel and quite a significant figure. He did step down from the New South Wales government and was before ICAC, but ICAC found that he was not corrupt, and he subsequently re-entered the Labor Party. But he certainly was involved in scandals.
And I'd also like to add, I know we're getting to questions very soon, but there is a natural marriage between these organizations, like what Ophir Birnbaum and Sophie Cowan were doing, like the Minority Impact Coalition, Queensland Jewish Collective, in the way that they're doing Hasbara, this, so-called non-political advocacy for, Jews' right to self-determination in their homeland or whatever it is they say it is. All apparently non-political. You get volunteers on the booth saying we were asked to sign up to defend Israel. That's what they told me. And there's this natural marriage between them and these groups like Institute of Public Affairs, Center of Independent Studies, and the groups above that. They're all tied to this international network called the Atlas Network, where billionaires will fund these junk think tanks that just pump out like fast food studies. And there's zero credibility to it, but people think, oh, it's a think tank. It's kind of academic, isn't it? Well, it's not. And they'll pretend to be champions of freedom and liberty and old school liberals, centrists, but really it's just a way for billionaires to pump money into a think tank so that they can launder their political ideology, which is really most of the time just whatever makes them an extra $1 billion. Increasingly, that's becoming the war machine. The military-industrial complex realizes, well, we can increase our net worth by funding these think tanks, and that means Hasbara, that means Zionism. When before, really, big coal mining was center place. And so when these groups say, oh, we're just traditional liberals and centrists, it presents their politics as not really, oh, we're not advocating for tax evasion. We're not advocating for, you know, less income tax for billionaires. We're advocating for common sense. And it's naturally morphed into Hasbara. So now what you have is the Israel lobby joining this pile on. Originally, it was just the AJA opposing the Greens. Now you have the entire Israel lobby joining the pile on. And they fired warning shots against Labour as well by saying, put the Greens last. But there was a call not just for voters to put the Greens last, but also for Labour Party preferences. So when Labour failed to do this, they were painted as Greens light. This was an anti-Labour campaign ran by the entirety of the Israel lobby, together with AJ and other far-right groups.
We definitely seen all these ads during the election. It was a crazy time. I really encourage everyone, if you want to learn more about the issues that we've discussed, you have your question, just pop it into the Q&A if you want to learn more. Also, you can check Wendy and Yaakov's articles at Michael West and other outlets. I do want to go to the questions now. Hopefully we'll get as many as possible of them. If we couldn't, we'll definitely take him up and then probably ask Wendy and Yaakov to answer them and send them back to everyone later on. Wendy, I think that question is for you from Stephen. If you would like to read it, I'll read it out loud for you. Down here in Nam on ABC, Melbourne, Ralph Epstein has flat out ghosted Gaza and West Bank on all the major stories, especially rulings at the UN. He failed to spend a second before or after on South Africa's genocide case against Israel, Amnesty's report on genocide, and findings in June 24 that the occupation is illegal. Is it worth the effort to complain and call out this bias, or am I wasting my energy?
I personally think it is worth complaining, but I also think not if you're really busy and you're not going to do other important things if you do it, but if you can manage it. And sometimes people, I mean, I've heard about Ralph Epstein. Obviously, I'm in Sydney. Look, I began earlier on by saying silence is a form of media control, if you like. It's a form of media manipulation, and it's not just a gap, it's also an active process. And so I think someone like Ralph Epstein, who has apparently from what you're saying, failed to cover significant media events. I think it is worth putting in a complaint, but it will be battered away. Those sort of silence complaints about not doing something are not going to be found to be a breach of the guidelines. So in that case, it may be better to document it publicly. And I think that's what is effective. We've now got quite a few people who are doing that. I noticed Jan Fran and Antoinette Latou for using their Instagram very effectively to critique the media. So, but where you get something like the Sally Sarah example I used with Gillian Siegel, where she really was out of line in not pulling her up when she was straight out defaming whole groups of people, I think then a complaint may go somewhere. Look, there are people inside the ABC, I know at least several of them, who have a very hard time, who may end up leaving because it is so hard, particularly if they're a fair way down, and they've got a long way to go in their careers and may walk away. But I think it's important to engage with the organisation. Just one last thing I'd say about people like Ralph Epstein, if he's seriously not covering something like the South African case, it is complicity. I've really come to sort of think more about this myself, that often when I was doing media studies, we're looking at things like gaps. But gaps, in this case, silence, has been so much revealed to be part of enabling something to happen, in this case of genocide.
Thanks,
I
Wendy.
think one of the most effective things that the Israel lobby actually does is organize their community members to do mass emails, petitions, sign statements, targeting media and politicians. So, if you see that, something like Nasser Mashni, it's got even more ammo now because Media Watch from the ABC has even reported on it. So you can cite the ABC against the ABC. APAN's website is really full of, email templates for this, and I really can't understate how effective that is as a vehicle for change.
That's really interesting. And this question is also for you, Yaakov. Can you explain how Zionism is inculcated into Australian Jews through the mainstream Jewish schools, synagogues, youth groups, and publications? If you could, identifying the different religious and cultural streams of each and giving some idea of the numbers in each stream. So the person who's asking this question, Hayward, is saying, I was raised modern Orthodox Jewish Zionist, which is the Mizrahi Synagogue, Ni Akiva Youth Group in Caulfield, and Yovne and Mount Scopus College Schools. Excuse my pronunciation. I left Judaism and Zionism decades ago. So could you give us an insight on his question?
Sure. Well, I mean, kudos to him, because leaving those communities is not easy. It's a difficult question to answer quickly, but I think the most important thing to understand is these, Hasbara or anti-Semitism training classes happen in Jewish day schools, and they happen at synagogues. So, you have, I mean, the first time I got it was probably like 13, 14. Most kids then don't even know who the Prime Minister of Israel or Australia is. And then there's B'nai Akiva, which is a youth group. They're one of around 8 or so that's active in Australia. And they are really big on joining the IDF, participating in the settlements, more so than a lot of the others. They're a religious Zionist. And a lot of these youth groups, I mean, most kids at Jewish day schools will at least attend several camps, weekend meetings for a youth group of their choice, and they're ones that also proclaim themselves to be, socialists, for whatever that's worth. Socialist Zionists. There's some that say that they're, openly fascist, like Beitar. But the Jewish day schools will go on Israel trips, usually at, after year 10 in the summer holidays. And the Zionist youth groups will go for a full year after high school. And both of these trips involve things like attending, IDF training camps, known as for the high school kids, Gardner, and for the 18-year-olds, Marva. And this isn't just a tourist trap where, you dress up some kids who think that, guns are cool. You dress them up in IDF uniform and they feel like they're getting the real thing. It's part of the indoctrination and the recruitment process. And in fact, a lot of the time, these trips are structured so that the IDF training occurs immediately after a trip to Auschwitz, where kids are taught that, the March of the Living, different Holocaust sites in Poland, where kids are taught that the Holocaust means that a Jewish state needs to exist, and that Jews need to stand up to defend Israel at all costs. That this is our civic duty. It creates this continuity in the indoctrination process of these Israel trips.
While we have that thread, there's a question there that I really am keen to hear both of you answer. How important was it to create Hamas to move the genocide to the next level? I think this question goes to the point of how important is Hamas in the Zionist psyche to promote its ideology. Wendy, if you want to get
I
in.
think Yaakov may be better. Just before we answer that one, I did want to add something to the question before, because I think
Sure.
it's important that, look, sometimes when you're writing a complaint, you may not think it's going to be worth it. But if you've got a case and it gets upheld, it really, I think documenting things is important. So you have a history. And I wanted to say that Ali Kazak, who died just recently, really important Palestinian person in Australia. He made a complaint against the Press Council in 1986 that was upheld. There was one upheld against Geraldine Doog a few years ago where they had to correct it online. I want to say that if you think there's a good case in the complaint, I do think it's worth your time, and to get other people to join you in it. But do you want to... I'm not quite sure what you're asking about Hamas. Are you saying that Israel needed Hamas?
That's how I understood that question. Unless someone, the questions, the person who wrote the question can clarify more. But yeah,
there's something interesting with this recent Eid massacre that's happened in the past couple of days, where Israel has spun the narrative from their own statements as saying, well, they've released CCTV footage, which is actually not from Rafah, where the massacre happened. And they claim that this footage is from the massacre, showing Hamas executing people as they're collecting aid. Now, it turns out that there's actually a Palestinian street gang that it strongly seems is backed by IDF through, dirty money. But the media took this narrative and ran with it. Oh, Hamas was executing people collecting aid. And, Hamas-linked sources say that there was a massacre, but we can't verify. Well, often when the media reports these things, it's literally just a random Palestinian in Gaza. But every Palestinian in Gaza to the Western media is considered Hamas. Now, there's many different resistance groups in Gaza that aren't Hamas. And, it's a political faction. It's a political party, and not all the political parties in Gaza get along. I mean, they're all trying to make government. But what's really interesting, yes, Israel needs Hamas to exist. Bibi needs them to exist if he's going to continue in power and continue demonizing the enemy as this, completely evil, totally evil beast, with just savages that need to be genocided. Because, you look at these most recent negotiations for a peace deal. Jeremy Scahill from Jobsite News reported that Hamas, as they've done in many previous negotiations, actually explicitly said, well, we want to step down If this we want to end the negotiations, that we will step down from power. We don't want to continue being a government, and we'll release all the hostages for a 5-year ceasefire. Now, Witkoff returned that proposal, said, well, best we can do is give you 60 days of ceasefire and Hamas stays in power.
And I wanted to add something there about Jeremy Scale, because it goes back to a point I made earlier. Jeremy Scale, for those, I think it's called Drop Site News, isn't it?
Yes.
He has, as Yaakov just said, he's got Hamas sources. Hamas, whatever one thinks about them, are a serious organization with serious policies. And as a journalist, you would want to have Hamas sources who you talk to and report what they say, which in a way was where Mary Kostakidis has come unstuck, because she dared to quote someone that they didn't think should be quoted. But all Jeremy Scale is doing in bringing out the Hamas version or side of this story in the relevant documents is doing what we call journalism. This is actually just following the story, telling people what's happening. But we've got a situation with large parts of the media, not just in Australia, who feel they cannot speak to anyone on the other side. So then the narrative automatically becomes one of, in this case, Israel's absolute demonization of Hamas. And one thing I would say is I think where it's coming, what people are really faced with now is in what's been happening for a long time, but this current 3 or 4 weeks particularly, when they're seeing what Massa Hashni described as a rogue state. Like, this is a rogue state. We're actually seeing it happening.
Absolutely. I know you have to go, Yaakov, but I do want to ask you this last question before you run, if
5
I may.
minutes.
Yes. So how damaging has Zionism been for Jewish people around the world, from your own experience?
Well, it sometimes this question can make me feel uncomfortable because yes, it's not good for Judaism, but I think it's really important to always center that right now there's a genocide going on, and sure, it's not great being an anti-Zionist Jew right now, but frankly, like I have family in Israel, and they're safe. I don't actually need to worry about whether next phone call I have with them is going to be the last one ever. And but it is important. I guess I will answer the question that you look back at the very first statements from people like Theodor Herzl. He said the anti-Semitic people will be our most dependable friends, and the anti-Semitic countries our closest allies. That's a direct quote. He said he wrote another essay about Marshall, he called it. Marshall was his characterization of the anti-Zionist Jew, which, keep in mind, Herzl invented political Zionism. So he's really talking about like 99% of Jews. And he said, the anti-Zionist Jew, characterized by this character he created called Marshall. He said Marshall is a swindler and a crook, the weakest of the weak, plays tricks on the stock market. I mean, this sounds like something Hitler would have said. He said he's a vermin. Literally said he's an inferior race. Now he's talking about 99% of Jews at his time there. You compare that today with the rhetoric of, well, you can't be anti-Zionist because the majority of Jews are Zionists, so that means you're anti most Jews. Well, that figure is roughly, I don't know, 70%, 80% of Jews are Zionists in Australia. It's not a bragging point. 80% of Jews, roughly, are pro-genocide. But there's nothing anti-Semitic in pointing that out. And in fact, the absolute gall, the arrogance of Herzl to talk about the vast majority of the Jewish population in his day, from day one, when he invented Zionism in those terms, really speaks for itself.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Wendy, did you want to add the last few words?
No, I'm fine.
Look, I do want to thank you, Yaakov and Wendy. We have a flood of questions, but unfortunately, we will have to go. But rest assured, we will aggregate all these questions
And we don't mind answering the questions. Yeah, it would be
yeah.
good to be able to. There's lots of good questions, obviously.
Thank you so much. And lastly, I really want to thank everyone who joined us today. And for those who registered and were not able to attend, we will send out the video recording of this webinar. This webinar was made free to attend and register, but some people donated generously. So I want to thank everyone who donated. And please follow the Palestine Justice Movement Sydney YouTube channel, because this is where you find all the video recordings, including this one. But I will send a link to this particular one in the next couple of days. Thank you very much again, and I will see you in the next webinar. Have a good night.